I'm very excited to be able to be here and share some of our work with our neighbors. If you do come to their space and peek in the window, this is what you'll see. We have this giant yes painted on the inside of our studio because we have this very positivist, constructive attitude towards making our work. And I think a lot of that is because of who we are. We have a really broad array of different disciplines and approaches, and we call ourselves experience designers. And what that means is that at the same time that we're working all around the world, so we're doing projects in Philadelphia. We just opened a sustainable fashion center in Amsterdam, which I'll share with you. We have 2 big projects in Australia. We're opening something for the Guggenheim Bilbao in December. We're doing the Courage Museum in San Francisco and Planet Word in Washington, D.C. But it's also about the diverse number of people that we have working at the studio. And that's because when we look to museums and public spaces, we think about engagement first. Right? And what does that mean? At its most fundamental level, for us, in terms of museums or stores or retail spaces or cultural spaces, we ask ourselves first and foremost, what can visitors do? Right? Like, what's the verb that you attach to how they're actually experiencing these spaces? And that's a really, really different thing than most architects or designers. They think about, what am I going to make? Right? We think about what the people are actually going to move through there and how they're going to be affected. A lot of that is because our first project was actually StoryCorps, if you know it. We partnered with Dave Isay. That's very nice. Thanks so much. So for those who don't know it, it's been described as a conspiracy to make all of America cry every Friday morning because the stories are so warm and overwhelming. But I'll play a quick clip just so you get a sense of it. Let's see here.
See, the thing of it is, I always feel guilty when I say I love you to you, and I say it so often. I say it to remind you that as dumpy as I am, it's coming from me. It's like hearing a beautiful song from a busted old radio. And it's nice of you to keep the radio around the house.
Now we've gone from there to look at a whole range of different types of experiences. We're well known for our integration of technology. This is an experience at the Cleveland Museum of Art where as you make different faces, different artworks come forward. So it really changes the way that the galleries work, right? It makes it participatory, it makes it performative, it makes it fun. Something that I know that all of you are constantly thinking about in terms of programming and engagement. We also did this piece, which shows you all 4,000 artworks on display at the museum all at the same time. So you can essentially be a curator yourself within that context. You're finding your own paintings, you're recommending them to people, you're making connections, you can load them onto a device, and then you can share them so that different people can understand what your favorite version of the Cleveland Museum of Art is. Right? And that, again, is a sort of different approach that we employ quite a bit, is thinking about a museum or an institution as a platform instead of a space where we will tell you, we're going to make a space for you to discover something about yourself. Right? And again, that's a really different approach than just saying, hey, we're the experts, let's tell you what to do. It's more, here's a bunch of resources, you can do amazing stuff with it. And again, we do that with all of these different disciplines working together and collaboratively, and it's very, very unusual to have all of these disciplines at the table at the same time. But when you start to bring them together, this, for example, is a new project that I think starts to exemplify what's possible. It's the world's first voice recognition museum. It's called Planet Word. It's going to open in Washington, D.C. in about 16 months. And so this is about a little under 1% of the entire English language. And it's an opening experience where you can ask different questions of these different words, and they'll tell you about where they came from and how they connect together and what the history of the language is. This is a gallery where you can discover 60 different world languages and be taught by native speakers how those languages work. Or this experience, which shares how you can literally paint with words. So you dip your paintbrush into different words, and when you paint on the wall, those words come to life. That's a new way to learn vocabulary and speaking. Right? Not all of these are very, very technologically sophisticated experiences, but none of them scream like touchscreen or computer or things that you click on. And that's a lot of where we're trying to move in terms of building these social and emotional experiences that bond people together. When we think about work, and again, this might seem very self-obvious, but we look to the vision and mission of the organization, and then we try and embody those things in a visitor experience. And that seems like super self-obvious, like who wouldn't do that? But one of the pieces of unsolicited advice I would offer to you is to really, really think when you're making an experience if it's actually really supporting the vision and mission, right? This is a typical experience or exercise for customer experience, right? You look for points of friction, or you look for things that don't support. If one of your goals is access, right? Like, how do you provide the most amount of access and work backwards from there? Because it's a very effective way, we find, to work with boards or with the general public to explain why you're making change. Right? Lots of people, and this is just typical of humans, are so used to how it's always been done, right, habituation, that it actually becomes very, very hard to change things, even if they are better, even if they are more convenient. Just that cognitive load of having to change, much less the social pressures, is a big challenge. So going back to your vision and mission, being able to say, well, we're doing it this way, we're bringing this programming, right, because it's part of our general mission for access, right? That can be, I think, very, very helpful. And we also look to these three ideas of attraction and engagement and emotion. So again, there's a range of different innovations that we think about and ways that we make these new experiences, but coming back to these core principles over and over again is how we sort of focus our work and make sure that we're hitting the mark. So I'm going to share with you just 5 quick projects with a couple of takeaways so that I can share with you some of the learnings that at least we've had. So the first is a project in Montgomery, Alabama. We just opened it this spring called the Legacy Museum. And the real lesson there is about standing in place. And part of that is because Brian Stevenson, the director and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, came to us over 4 years ago and said he wanted to make a narrative museum, a different type of museum, around American history. And he said in his own words, you know, when the Supreme Court voted against upholding a lot of the statutes within the Voting Rights Act, and Justice Scalia said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that essentially America didn't have a race problem anymore. Like, that's a narrative problem, right? That's not a legal problem, if that's actually the sort of mindset that you're dealing with. And so he started moving his organization from just working with incarcerated people or people on death row and making legal arguments into this narrative space. He developed what's now called the Memorial to Peace and Justice, which is colloquially called the Lynching Memorial, and then also engaged us to make the Legacy Museum, which has this amazing quote from Maya Angelou on its side: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again," which gives you a good sense of the posture of this organization, right? They're steeped in history, but they're doing it specifically because they have a very concrete activist message about the future and where they're trying to go. When you go in, we have this message here. You are standing on a site where enslaved people were warehoused, as well as the logo that we designed, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, which was its original title. And this really gives a sense of the power of place. And then we have a range of different experiences that mix together primary sources with artistic sculptures and installations, really meant to bring out a full range of the emotion of this experience. So it's a very interesting mixture between the two that sit together. And then at the end of the experience, we have these visitation booths where you're watching videos from different clients of EGI talking about their experience being incarcerated. And in the last experience, or a sort of central experience, we have this quote: "If we have the courage and tenacity of our forebears, who stood firmly like a rock against the lash of slavery, we shall find a way to do for our day what they did for theirs." And that's from Mary McLeod Bethune. And that, of course, is a core aspect of how people are moving through this experience, is that it has a very activist spirit based on the Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson's incredible work. And it not only doesn't shy away from that whatsoever, it sees the lack of neutrality as a beacon that draws people to it. And in fact, they've had an incredible amount of both media attention and also visitation. They've exceeded their original estimates within about 4 months for visitation. So it's been a really incredible and transformational project, both for EGI and for the narratives that they're talking about, but also, frankly, for Montgomery, which is super interesting as well. One of the things that really helped in this case is that Brian worked very, very deeply with a lot of different members of the community early on, and talk to them not just about the ways in which they are tackling these stories with a moral or ethical approach, but also, frankly, how it would help to develop Montgomery and bring more activity to it. And so that's one interesting aspect of these types of projects is you can actually draw activity, and that can actually be a way to help to make better partnerships as you're moving them forward. The second project I'm going to share is here in New York City, and the real takeaway here is inventing with purpose. This is a project that we developed for the Cooper Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum. So we opened this a couple years ago, and we essentially worked with their mission, which is very, very simple. It's to empower people through design. That's the entire mission. It's dead simple. And we said, well, why don't we, instead of telling people about design, give them a pen and allow them to experience design themselves? Right? Super simple idea, but has amazing implications, like here where you draw a line and it'll bring forward parts of the collection based on what you're drawing. Or you can also use the pen throughout the different galleries and select and save lots and lots of these artworks all throughout the galleries. And that becomes a point of inspiration for you, right? So if you're moving through and you see this amazing work, you just drop it in your pen and you save everything to your pen. And then you can actually retrieve these items when you return back home. So you're developing this long-term relationship with the museum, which is very, very rare. You can design buildings, you can design furniture, you can design fashion. There's all of these different channels for expressing yourself. And again, learning about design and making you even hungrier to look at their collections. And then we have this space, which the New York Times called the beating heart of the museum, which is the immersion room where you get to design your own wallpaper. The museum has this incredible world-class wallpaper collection. And it actually was quite shocking, I think, even to us, much less the client, that the wallpaper collection is like the star of the entire show. People just love the wallpaper room. And part of it is because pattern is so effectively shared, and people suddenly are hungry to look at historic patterns, even as they're designing their own patterns. And of course, when you make a platform for self-expression, suddenly this space is really, really transformed into a place of exploration. So it works with lots of different age groups, all different sorts of people. It's quite sophisticated, but also simple. I think this is the world's first bacon and eggs wallpaper. I might be wrong, but I think it's the first, right? And when you build these spaces that people can express themselves, suddenly people do all this stuff that you really never expected, and that's part of the joy of the work. It's not without its inherent risks, right? But when you get into a world where people can actually make themselves felt, the museum leans into that with these different challenges. But like these are literally just pieces that I grabbed off social media. And there's like, a couple of hundred of these every week. And that really adds up when you have this level of promotion for an institution. And again, the ingenuity that you find, like this is certainly nothing that we had ever imagined. It's an incredible way to, again, put that mission into action. They're empowering people through design, and sure enough, lo and behold, you make this platform, you trust that people are going to do amazing things with it, and they're constantly sharing things about how awesome the museum is, that it has allowed and frankly empowered them to do these things. The third project I want to share is the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which we worked on for 8 years, huge, long-standing project, and part of what we took away from this project was that, especially with the right leadership, and in this case, Mayor Bloomberg was both the mayor of New York at that time, but also the chairman of the board. And he said directly to the staff, he said, look, no matter what happens, people are going to be really, really upset with this museum. It's a challenging subject. It's a very, very heated political climate, and it's going to be controversial. He said, so just to be clear, given that, do not make the safe choice. Because no matter what we choose, we're going to get given a hard time within the press. And sure enough, even though now it's seen as a very, very positive, successful project for a variety of reasons, during those 8 years, it was really, really hard. We pretty much did not get a good break on any individual news cycles. And I can tell you it was a very, very challenging process. But Mayor Bloomberg had the presence of mind to say, choose the right firm, make the right project. Make something that will actually serve the people, that will actually tell the story, that will actually embody the level of emotion and history that we need to memorialize here on this site. And that literally made all the difference in the world and allowed the board actually to choose my firm in partnership with another. At the time, we were literally 3 people. It was inconceivable that we would be invited to the competition, although we were, much less actually win the project. And part of it was the pitch. What we said to them was, we want to make, again, a space that's a platform, a space where we won't tell you about 9/11, because we knew that there would be hundreds or thousands of survivors walking through the museum who would know much more about the event than we would ever know, right? But we also knew it needed to service young people, teenagers who knew nothing about the event. And the way we did that was we said, well, we're going to gather and tell the stories of one and engage the others. So when you walk into the museum, there's not a big plaque on the wall that says, hey, a third of the world watched this event live. You actually walk into a space of memory that embodies that with this moment of global witness. So there's this world map made up of all these different memories, and it sounds like this when you walk in.
On the day of September 11th, 2001.
On September 11th.
September 11th.
I was in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Cairo, Egypt. Des Champs-Élysées à Paris.
In college at UC
I was
Berkeley.
in Times Square.
São Paulo do Brasil.
Estaba en Miami, Florida.
The Scottish Highlands.
We were actually in a meeting when someone barged in and said,
Oh my God, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
Kind of frantically get to a radio.
When I heard it over the radio.
And so you hear people's first experiences with 9/11, bringing you back to that moment. Then you see people who are witnessing it firsthand. And then you yourself at the bottom of that ramp stand in this huge open space filled with a wall that withstood the pressure of the Hudson. And you yourself bear witness in that moment. There's a huge array of different experiences. We have this one, the memorial exhibition, that allows you to select any individual and to see individual artifacts or hear individual stories from them. So it's a very, and this space is also in partnership with StoryCorps, so a lot of the oral histories that are shared there come from that archive. There are experiences that are designed to be incredibly overwhelming. So this is the moments of grief, the full year of the aftermath. Other spaces that are completely absent, except for people's memories. And then we also have two experiences at the end that try very hard to contextualize 9/11 today. So these are ever-changing. This is an algorithmic piece, so it's looking at 4 million different news articles from 9/11, 2001, all the way to today, and it updates every single day based on the headlines. So it's constantly showing you 9/11 in the news today and how news from the Middle East, news around public safety, news around privacy goes back to 9/11. Or this is our last experience where the narrative map you saw at the beginning is then redeveloped, made out of visitors' own voices. So you can add your own stories or your own responses. And these are literally just 3 that I shot on my phone when I was there. My father came home from work that day in a dusty suit. I thank God he came at all. I miss you both every day. Love you. Love you, Dad and Chris. Love John. Or even this one, we were mere kids when this happened, and now as adults we understand the impact of this tragic event. And it makes you aware of just the depth of which people are able to participate in these types of experiences. One thing that has been amazing to us, at least, is the level of engagement that this museum has produced. Just this year, actually, we were honored that TripAdvisor announced that the 9/11 Memorial Museum is the #1 most recommended site in the world. And that, I think, really comes out of the strength of the experience itself, right? I mean, that's what's kind of amazing about that statistic or that honor, and it comes directly from the director of the whole foundation. He always says, you know, when you ask me what my metrics of success are, like how do I measure success? I don't. I just go online and I look what people say, right? And if people online are, especially in a day and age where you have a lot of particularly savage voices out there, are endorsing you and engaging with you, you have an amazing experience. That's really different than having something that's been marketed or that's been explained well. You have something that's so powerful, people just of their own volition go back online afterwards and say, you have to go see this. This changed me, this moved me. And that is really very, very powerful. In fact, we argue that it's the most powerful thing that you can develop today. So I'll just show 2 more things. This is a new project that we just opened. And the tagline I'm using here is "Don't fear the amazing." I think that there's something, certainly that we sometimes fall into, and maybe you do as well, where you're trying to be neutral, or you're trying to have stature, or you're trying to avoid things that might feel sort of commercial or flashy because you take yourself seriously, and that's great. On the other hand, we have found that particularly depending on the topic that you're dealing with, it can be of great benefit to seem as engaging and interesting as possible. This is a project, it's a sustainable fashion center in Amsterdam, And essentially, we were engaged to think about how fashion, or sustainable fashion in particular, is basically where organic food was a generation and a half ago. If you think about it, at that point, nobody really ate those vegetables because it was particularly good for you or that they looked great. It was a political act, right? If I think about organic food from when I was young, most of them were sort of shriveled and they were sold at sort of like alternative food markets in a very, very small way. However, people essentially invested in that approach, and Whole Foods was a big driver of this, and now you have this huge market for it. Lots of people buying big, bountiful, amazing vegetables that they think are better for them and that they think are better for their children. All that's awesome. The byproduct of that is a huge amount of investment in organic farming, which is very, very good for the earth, right? So you have this political movement that essentially made it a shift into the big time based on a commercial movement. And sustainable fashion is in exactly the same place. And so this is a project that looks essentially to use fashion. I'm going to play a video that we made, use the tropes of fashion to get people interested in this and start to shift this into the mainstream. So this experience has this bracelet at the heart of it. This is actually made out of plastic that's literally dredged out of the canals of Amsterdam. And you use this to not just shop for physical products, but also for actions, different things that you would do as a consumer to change your habits and to make fashion more sustainable. So we have this experience where you can design your own t-shirt. It's the first what's called C2C, cradle to cradle, meaning it's completely made out of organic materials, and then it also can be completely recycled. This is the shop itself, the Good Shop, which ships both individual products, but also has these larger actions that you can commit to. So even something simple, and if you're of a certain generation, this is actually quite radical. This idea of not buying anything new for 30 days is completely contrary to fast fashion, right? The sort of addictive weekly behavior, or more than that. But again, getting young consumers to think to themselves, oh, right, what would happen if I would do that? That has a larger sustainable impact, which then gets put together in this space, connecting together all the individual actions to show that that's essentially how you change the world, is one individual action at a time, which gathers into a community and to the larger global impact. And so with the last project I'm going to share, and this I think is something that we try and put into all of our projects, both in terms of what we're trying to do and then also in terms of where culture and society is today, making things that are both sort of ambitious but also weird is, I think, particularly for some institutions, seen as a risk. And we argue that we think it's kind of the opposite. Making things that are kind of generic, that's the risk, right? Because we live in what would be called the attention economy, but we all feel it in our lives, right? There's no end to the things to gather our attention. And that's the reality. Like when I was growing up, people used to watch things on TV, and you'd be like, why are you watching? You'd be like, 'cause it's on, right? That just doesn't exist anymore. Endless channels, endless surplus of lots of things screaming for our attention constantly. And that has a lot to do, I think, with just how the world is evolving these days, is that utter screaming for attention. And so again, if you want attention, not shockingly, doing something that's unorthodox, something that's unique, and tying it to your mission is actually a surprisingly safe bet. Well, we're going to make this experiment. We're going to bring this group on or that group on, or we're going to try a different way of doing things. In this case, this is an art museum called the Aarhus Art Museum. This is in Denmark. And they have an amazing history of lots and lots of crazy experiments. This is a piece by the artist Olafur Eliasson on the roof, which is amazing. They're a contemporary as well as a historic art museum. They're in the second largest city in Denmark. And they have more members in this museum than they have people who live in the city. Right? And that's a shocking, anybody who's like, you're like, wow, how do you do that? Well, the way that they do that is focus on the visitors first and foremost. This is a project that we are brought in, Aarhus Public, which is, I think, a very interesting model. It essentially mixes together artist studios, programming for lots of different ages, social space. They have different performances, obviously, and then they also have journalists working in this space. So it's a huge public space that is meant essentially as sort of like a next generation members lounge. And the director always called it a mental fitness center. Now this fellow is super interesting, Erlen Hoyliston, and he looks like a roadie from Metalhead. He sort of speaks in these really weird, really elliptical statements. He said, at the time, he said, when he came to visit me in New York, he sort of mumbles. He's like, oh, I saw Cooper Hewitt. I thought it was beautiful and amazing. I don't want the Cooper Hewitt. I said, okay, that's fine. I said, what do you want? He said, well, I would like a perfect museum. I want a friend that you want to spend time with. It sometimes talks and sometimes listens. It's sometimes funny, but it makes you a better person. And I was like, oh, okay. That sounds interesting. And then he said, we talk about Aros as a mental fitness center. At first you start with light weights, and then you get to heavier experiences, and so on. I was like, oh, okay. And then he was like, and you should have a social effect. You need to take a stand to talk to the broader public. And then lastly he said, and you have to think to yourself, what is unique about digital? When we do a Monet experience, they're standing in front of a unique painting. No one else has this. Don't just do what a book can do. How can you use this tool to become a body and a social experience? All of which was super inspiring. And then I said to him, well, how do you think we can do that? And he was like, well, I don't know, that's your job. And then he laughed, and I was like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Right, because these are amazing aspirations, but seem, pretty challenging when you think about it. So we did what we do. We worked with a curator, so that's the head of education in the middle, and really thought about these technologies and what they could offer. And so we started playing with different technologies. This is actually an eye tracking experience that uses military-grade eye tracking and pupil dilation to allow us to look at how visitors look at artworks. This is a story booth, so building on our work with StoryCorps that allows people to have prompted conversations about artworks. And then we have a third experience that I can also show that has a clear screen that allows you to make portraits. So this is the first project I'll share from there. It's called The Art of Looking. And again, it makes people aware of themselves as active participants within artworks. So you think about artworks. Again, most of the time, the artist is there like, oh, how am I going to make the artwork? This is an artwork that makes people aware of their own presence inside of these spaces. So as they're seeing the way in which they're connecting together different parts of the artwork, it can show that to them, right? And then it can also show them where they might have missed, how they differ. And it makes people just aware of the fact that this is an art relationship. They're getting something from the artwork. They're making something out of the artwork specifically by how they look. The second piece is a portrait machine. So it allows you to look through this clear screen and use artworks from the collection to share something about the people that you're there with. Right? So it's specifically making the art a literal medium of connection between you and other folks, and allows a huge amount of accessibility in different ages to work within this experience and to actively dig into the collection in a way that they just wouldn't otherwise. One of the things that the curator always says is when they do studies, the average time that people look at artworks is 3 seconds, right? And that makes some sense when you're sort of glossing your way through a huge encyclopedic space. The first piece has an average, meaning the eye detection, of 5 minutes, which is what makes them love it. And same with this. They have all these periods of discovery. And then lastly, this is what we call the art of conversing. And it's a space where you go in, and it poses these different unique questions to you about unique artworks. So this is a question about this contemporary work. And I'll just share with you one of the videos we have. This is actually Erlen himself with another artist. But this is like typical. The questions, again, they're meant to be weird. We used to have very open questions, and we tested them. People weren't really responsive. But we have all these really, really strange questions that sort of put a narrative into your head. And then here's the type of stuff that we get as people are experiencing.
But what I'm wondering is what kind of sound will this chopper make? Can you try to make that sound?
A sound? It will,
Well,
I
what's the
think
type of-
I know. La 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 la. A Lady Gaga song, of course.
Of course. I guess,
It's a Lady
yeah,
Gaga
but also
thing.
the sound of the feathers.
No. There would be the la 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 la.
a bit intimidating.
I actually had the curator say that when she has particularly down days, she goes into the folder and just watches these over and over again, because it gives her this sense of the human connection with these artworks. And maybe you've had this experience in your own institutions, but art museums are designed to make people quiet. They're designed to actually be alone there and actually look at the artworks, and that can be really amazing, that can be very reflective, but not necessarily the thing that really stays with you. And so in closing, when you think about all of these different elements put together, the ways in which you can make platforms, the ways in which you can ask people to stand in place, or to invent with purpose, to dream for the ages, to not fear the amazing, and most of all, to think big and think weird, I think there's a lot of inspiration to come. And with that, I'll say thank you so much.